Welcome to Figuring Out Fabric, where I ask dumb questions and you get smart answers. I've got my friend Cathrine Wilhemsen, or Cathrine. What's the right way to pronounce your name?
Cathrine.
Katrina. I know you've
Yeah,
given up on us Americans, but I like to be able to get people's names right. Uh,
Cathrine works.
okay, fair enough. And then you've been, I didn't realize it was this long. You've been a data platform MVP for a decade.
Yes.
That's a long time.
It is
That's
a
very
very
impressive.
long time. Yep.
Yeah. And then you have organized a conference specifically for Fabric,
Yep.
and you somehow managed to get the Guy in the Cube guys to come all the way out to sunny Norway to in February to the conference, and then
Yes.
finally you are a semi-recent dog mom because it's still a puppy, right? Or how
Still a
old is it?
puppy.
Yeah.
9 months old now. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Cool. And today, I really loved your presentation at Past Summit about actual implementation with Fabric. And so I was hoping you could help us understand like this whole medallion architecture. Like, do we need to pull out the periodic table and start learning all the metals and all that kind of stuff?
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So I think my session, we covered basically what we've learned from implementing real world projects
Right.
for the past year and a half. And I feel like mostly me, I want to say my coworkers, but it's mostly me making these decisions. I feel like we've tried everything, really.
Sure.
And the short answer to everything Fabric is it depends. Trademark.
Right, right, right.
As consultants, it really is. It depends. But let's try and have a chat today about what it depends on, and
Okay.
see if we can kind of make things a little bit more tangible to the listeners. I have no slides, so just ask
It's
questions
just
if
just a
I
conversation. Yeah.
yeah
Yeah, and some people will be listening just audio only on, on their
yeah
commute and that sort of thing. So I guess starting kind of question, and you can help me out here because we had a little bit of back and forth on social media because I was doing some tests for a blog post, and I'm learning that I don't want to be a data engineer. This is all confusing. But one of the things that was kind of, I don't know if it was a light bulb or frustration point, is every time that I've heard someone talk about data lake, and I think this is because before Fabric we had just data lake storage. They talked about these zones and they talked about these folders, and I got the impression that it's one big lake, right? It's just one big file folder. But in Fabric, there's kind of this, as far as I understand it, this enforcement of some of the separation. Like you can connect it all with shortcuts and stuff, but there's no way easily that you can just dump information in there. You're going to be making a lake house or some other option. They're probably a lake house. And that lake house then needs a workspace. So help me understand the structure that every single big data lake kind of talk that I attended up until recently, and especially yours, where you actually went into it, help me understand why we went from like, oh, it's just one big folder. And so zones and folder names is really important to actually know we have these different items and different units of measure.
yeah. So I think there are different perspectives that you can look at it.
Sure.
But if you look at it from the Microsoft marketing way, you have one lake, right? You don't have two lakes or three lakes or four lakes. It's
Right.
all one lake. And one lake is aligned to your tenant, which is basically your organization, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So your organization can have one lake. So that is kind of the logical area where all of your data is stored. But then you have to figure out where do you want to put things into your one lake. So you can't just drop it into one lake, like you said. You have to put it into a specific area. And the reason for that is, there are multiple ways to look at it. It could be for security reasons, where you want to have certain areas for certain departments, sensitive data, and so on. Or it could be just separating things based on business area. So
Right.
whatever makes sense to you to separate it is how you choose to kind of structure the content within your one lake. And the way that you do that in Fabric is, like you said, first of all, you need to have a capacity or more. You can have
Yes.
one or more capacities, which is basically just the compute power that you can use in Fabric. And then let's say that you have two different capacities, one small one for development and one large one for production, for example. Could be a good way to separate it, or you could have one for one business area or one for the other. And on that capacity, you can create one or more workspaces. So you can have 100 workspaces, or you can have just one. Completely up to you. Again, depends on how you want to separate things out. And then within those workspaces, you create the actual Fabric items. One item is the lake house. And I think that when we're going forward with Fabric, I think lake house is the way to go for most people. That's where you get basically all the cool new shiny stuff. You can create the warehouse as well, but you're kind of, and I'm saying this in like quotation marks, stuck with just the good old SQL part. But in lake houses, that's where you get the flexibility. So inside of a lake house, you can have two different types of items. So you can have the lake house tables, the Delta tables, or you can have anything within the files section. So like you started, if you just want to drop something inside of your one lake, you have to create your tenant in Entra ID. You probably have that already. Then you need a Fabric capacity. You need a workspace. Then you need to create a lake house, and then you can drop whatever files you want into the files area of that lake house. So it's a little bit more complicated than just dropping things into one lake. But hopefully this is not something that you do all the time. And I would say once you get kind of the capacity and workspaces set up, creating the lake house itself, it's one click. Like you create a lake house, you give it a name, and you have the lake house. And once you have that, you can open it up using the One Lake File Explorer. So you can actually drag and drop between your computer and the One Lake itself, or just do it through the web browser. So a few more steps than
stable. Sorry.
Yes.
Because the tests I did was with like 194 gigabytes of files. And they were like, most of them were 2 gigabyte files. And it's funny because normally when I download a bunch of stuff, because I do 3D printing, I'll download these giant STL files with Chrome, and inevitably it'll just crap out, and like some of them will fail after we do it. The upload worked fine, right? Like I told it, here's my 195 gigabyte files. I would like to upload these files. Now, it was the most expensive in terms of CUs, which was interesting, right? But it's a convenience feature. Like, hopefully you're not using it to upload a terabyte of data.
Yeah.
So I was really impressed with that. And the One Lake thing, One Lake File Explorer, from what I can tell, it looks like it really is based off of OneDrive in terms of the coding. And that worked pretty well also. It was a little bit slow, but mostly because I was dumb and I didn't know how disk management worked in Azure. So I asked for 1 terabyte, and then I didn't think through the fact that I didn't know how to extend the image. So I made a new disk, but I was basically copying like 30 gigs at a time from the disk onto itself. And I just saturated it, right?
Yeah.
Even though I went for the premium SSD. So it took 2 hours, I want to say, to upload everything, because the performance just kept going down. But again, hopefully no one's uploading 194 gigabytes, but even if you are, it worked. So I am really impressed with the ease that they've made it. Like when you're starting out, just get the data in there and then start playing around with it.
I mean, I'm never going to underestimate what people can do in Excel, but I don't think you can have like multi-terabyte Excel files. Hopefully.
No. So there's, cause I did some other like importing into Power BI. I did some benchmarking, and there's the 1 million row limit. And then I tested Access, which was almost as performant as Parquet, which is horrifying to read MS Access. But there's a 2 gigabyte file limit on that. So I think we're safe from big data Excel for now. Yeah. So
but that could be like a whole different conversation. Like, how can you do things in Fabric in the way that you should absolutely not do things? I've had this conversation. I'm going completely off on a tangent.
No, it's a casual conversation. I like the lived experience. Go ahead.
Yeah. So now you can have your semantic models. You can choose to sync those back into one lake, right?
I saw that. It's like an Ouroboros, right?
Yes. So imagine if you have people just working in Excel and you're syncing that back and you're creating your entire lake house based on these Excel files. I'm sure someone could create the worst possible solution ever in Fabric.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a new goal. That could be a fun blog post. How can we break things?
Well, so like I want to eventually do a performance tuning post on CSV to Delta. And like you said, you can turn on I don't know the term, but integration from semantic model to one lake. It's basically saving back. And you can do that for event houses and all this kind of stuff. But I'm like, is it even worth recording the performance and the cost? Because like, who would do that? Like, I get there's reasons and stuff, but presumably that's putting the cart before the horse in a lot of these cases. And actually that probably is a good pivot. So, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the Medallion stuff in the lake houses? Because I really liked how one of the options you talked about is, well, you really don't necessarily need a separate bronze and silver if the lake house is already built, so you have files and delta tables, right? So you want to talk a little about some of that structure?
Yeah, we can do that. So let's just go back and talk a little bit about the Medallion architecture itself.
Yeah, fair. I shouldn't assume.
Yeah. So that is basically just new shiny words for things we've done for like decades already.
Yes.
So if you look at the good old database, data warehouse side of things, you had things like staging, you had enterprise data warehouse, you had data marts, you had all of these different terms for the different layers that your data is being moved through. And the same thing goes for the Medallion architecture. So Medallion architecture with bronze, silver, and gold, it's just a logical concept, right? And it tells the people using it how good the data quality is in the layer that you're in. So if you're in bronze, you're expecting that the data quality is not as good as in gold. But then you have people who go like, oh, but we need 4 layers. So how do we do that? Do we create a platinum layer? Do we have a diamond layer? Do we
Pure layer? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have to come up with like the periodic table of Medallion architecture, right?
Right.
But the whole idea is that you start with data that is in its raw format or as close to raw as possible. So it should be as similar to the source as possible. And depending on the source, I mean, if you're grabbing things from an API, you can stream that probably as JSON data into JSON files, or you can ingest it right into Delta tables. So you kind of still have to pick and choose because it's not exactly the same as you have in the source, but it's like as close as you get to it. If you're going from a relational database, it might not make sense to store that as files before moving it back into Delta tables, right? So you have all of these little trade-offs, and you kind of have to figure out how do you define raw data or bronze data. But what I see is a common pattern is you want to probably use the files area in the lakehouse for a lot of your raw data, so all of the unstructured and semi-structured data. And then you can use Delta tables for whatever is coming from a relational source already, or like Parquet columnar format, basically. And then once you get it into bronze, that part is easy. It's basically just getting everything in, and you want to make sure that you're storing all the history, whether that is creating like a date hierarchy of folders where you store one file per day or per hour or whatever, or you have it in a Delta table with like an ingest timestamp or like a batch number or something to kind of define what that data is. Once you go from there, that's when you get into the fun part. So how do you go from that raw data and get it into the end goal, which is a star schema with facts and dimensions? So gold is also very easy, or I mean, platinum, diamond, whatever, the last layer that you have is where you want your facts and dimensions. Facts should be purely measures and keys, and dimensions should contain all of your attributes. You want to make sure that you store it in that way just to make things run faster in Power BI. You know, star schema, all the things. So the middle layer is where, again, it depends, right? How do you want to take it from raw and get it into that, I would say, enterprise data model? And there are so many ways you can do that. So the first thing is like, if you want to do everything within one lakehouse, you can, for example, if you ingest all the raw data into your files area, you can then transform it from files into Delta tables and say that, okay, the files area is my bronze and the Delta tables is my silver area. You can easily do that. Or if you ingest things into delta tables in bronze, you can create views on top of that and say that the views is my silver area. And then you get into all of these technical details where now you can create lakehouses with schemas enabled, so you can separate things by schemas. And from there, you can kind of expand it as far as you want to go, basically. Maybe you want to have 2 lakehouses. So you have 1 lakehouse for bronze, 1 for silver, and a third one for gold. Maybe you want to combine bronze and silver if you have files and tables being bronze and silver. Or maybe you want to separate things into multiple workspaces and like completely separate your areas, right? And there are many, it depends on this. But what I would say is what we have found is bronze and silver is a good option for kind of combining those into one physical lakehouse and just decide whether you want to use files, delta tables, views, or whatever, and then have a separate area for your gold data. That seems to work well for us because it gives you the flexibility of creating views on top of your files or views on top of delta tables, and basically just having that, embracing the Microsoft concept of one copy of your data. If you ingest it into bronze, you work with views and kind of have that logical layer for silver. And then you create the actual copy when you transform it and reshape it into gold. So the views area could be just like simple data cleaning. You might want to make sure that your columns are of specific types. You might want to do some renaming, remove some columns, deduplicate data, things like that. So you could end up with silver just being kind of like a clean area of bronze. Or you can make sure that silver is more that enterprise view where maybe you start reshaping it a little bit, but it's not completely dimensions and facts yet. So again, there are like a million different ways of doing this. And I think my key takeaway is to kind of just think about what makes sense to you in terms of what kind of data are you pulling in? How do you want to kind of define your silver layer? Should that be more source aligned or should that be more dimensional model aligned? And then look at how you want to separate things in terms of user access as well. So maybe you want to have like bronze and silver be in a separate workspace where you give access to data engineers and maybe some data scientists, but then the gold kind of area should be something that your super users can connect to.
So there's like 4 different things I want to pick out of that. So, so first, I really like the description of instead of trying to figure out these amorphous layers, thinking of, okay, we know what the endpoints are. We know bronze is however you have it right now. And maybe you're getting it in there slightly different, but it's as raw as it's the raw steak. We haven't cooked it. And then we know the final product. We know that's a star schema. That's your burger, but all the stuff in between, what you do with spices, that can vary. And so I really like the idea of like silver that can move between that goalposts or those endpoints or whatever you want to call it. So like you said, your silver could be, Chris in accounting hit load to table on your raw CSV, and now you have a table, right? Or it could be that it's actually pretty much your enterprise data warehouse and your gold is maybe even less. Like, okay, we don't need those columns for our reports. Let's not confuse the users, right? It could be your, like, on some level, it could be your semantic model for Power BI. It could be like, okay, here's the stuff that like we know we need, because depending on your source system, I don't know if you've ever dealt with any of the variations of dynamics like Navision or Great Plains. You've got tables with like 50 columns and the business doesn't want to throw them away. But I promise you, you don't necessarily need that like currency conversion column if you're just in the United States or whatever, right? So I like the idea of instead of trying to have a prescriptive definition, thinking about these axes, thinking about, okay, where do we want to move it? That silver layer, and then also the security kind of piece. So like that's really helpful. But then there's 2 conflicting themes that I'm hearing kind of in your answer. So I'm going to use an analogy with Power BI. So I don't know how much you had to deal with Power BI deployments back in the Wild West before we had deployment pipelines or DevOps or any of that kind of stuff. But it was basically you just made up your own pattern, right? Like, and even with deployment pipelines, it's like, do we have a dev test QA? Like, do we have, sorry, dev test prod? Do we have 3 different workspaces? Do we just have stuff named different? Do we use Power BI apps as our prod and you kind of move from the workspace to there? And like, it's gotten better in terms of options, although we have competing options because we have deployment pipelines and we have DevOps pipelines, and you have to explain they're both different and they support different items. So DevOps doesn't support Power BI dashboards, right?
Yeah.
So some of it sounds like it's that, where it's just like, you just got to pick a path and make it work for you. But then the other thing that I'm hearing is there's a certain amount of like how much the technology is interwoven and the platform is interwoven in a way that wasn't the case with, say, just on-prem SQL Server or Power BI, where, you know, if you're dealing with a lakehouse or a warehouse, you don't necessarily have, say, certain indexes, right? Or I learned recently the Fabric Data Warehouse doesn't support nchar and varchar. It doesn't have those types. And so it sounds like some of it is just do what makes sense. But then, unlike with more of the front end stuff, choosing the right tool has an impact on the foundation. And so you have to be more thoughtful about that. And that's, I guess, the data engineering piece, right?
Yeah. So you're touching on like multiple things. I mean, we could talk for hours on each of these. So I think the one thing you mentioned about dev test prod or having like multiple areas in terms of deploying between different environments, that is taking it one step further, right?
Sure.
In our architecture. So this is something that I do want to point out. It is probably obvious for a lot of people, but I've had this conversation with others who are new to data engineering, or they're coming from like the Power BI side. And one thing to make very clear is that the Medallion architecture, bronze, silver, and gold, has nothing to do with your environments in terms of dev, test, production, right? So those are 2 different kind of axes. So Medallion architecture speaks about the data quality. So it goes from raw data into like complete enterprise data model versus deployment pipelines and environments where you have your development environment that you can do whatever you want. You can go bananas in there. And then you deploy it to test, where you need to have a little bit more strict guidelines on when to update it. You have users coming in, testing it, checking that everything works. You might do integration testing with other systems and so on. And then into production, where you are actually serving things to your users. And that complicates things even further when we look at like the physical actual architecture of things in Fabric, because if you end up having, let's say you have one workspace with 3 lakehouses. You have your bronze, silver, and gold lakehouse. You would need to have that in your development environment. You would need to have the same kind of like the next workspace with the same 3 lakehouses in test. Yeah. And the third workspace with 3 new lakehouses in production. And then you probably want to, there are a couple of different ways of doing this, but if you have a source that also has dev, test, and prod environments, in each of those workspaces, you want to make sure that you connect to the right environment in your source data as well.
Yeah.
Or you can do it the way that we've done in a couple of projects, that we are working on production data in all of those environments by doing all of the loading in our production environment. And then in dev and test, we're shortcutting to our production bronze data. So that means that we have access to production data in development and test. Obviously, you need to make sure that you can work with production data in development and test.
I was about to ask, like PII and stuff makes it very difficult. Yeah.
A lot of
totally
people
different.
can't
I know.
do that. We are fortunate enough that we can't do that. And that means that we can make sure that our bronze layer in production is running smoothly, and then just create a shortcut in our development and test environments. That means that we are always looking at like the raw production data, and then we can work on silver and gold in development. We can, continue working on things developing, deploy that into test, and let our users check that everything looks fine before we deploy it into production. And we know that when we're doing things in development and test, we're working on production data, so it's going to work once we deployed into production. So at
a
this
lot.
point,
That's a lot.
you're now like in terms of the actual items that you need to create just to kind of have a lake house in Fabric, you're looking at multiple lake houses and multiple workspaces.
Potentially 9 of them, right?
Yes.
If you do 3 layers and 3 prod, whatever, you know what I
Yes.
mean? That's times 9 for every single thing.
Yes.
I can see why they made shortcuts, right?
Absolutely. And then you have like the other things where, okay, so let's say you have 3 workspaces, dev, test, and prod, but then you might want to separate your kind of back end, your lakehouses, data engineering items, and your front end, looking at your semantic models and reports, because you might have 2 different teams. So now you have like 2 workspaces for each environment. So you have like 2 in dev, 2 in test, 2 in prod, right?
Yep.
And then the
I'm
final
with you.
thing,
I'm with you.
just to make things easy for everyone, is if you are developing things in Fabric as a team, you should also have a separate development workspace that is just for you individually, that is connected to your branches that you are working in. So now in your development environment, you might also have, say you have 4 developers, you have like the main dev, the shared dev environment, and then 4 workspaces with all of these items. So again, this is why I said having slides would help having this conversation, because
and the problem is we're trying to do like someone's walking their dog and they're trying to learn, and now they're having
To
like
visualize
matrix
it.
math, right? Just like 3 times 3 and times 2. No, I appreciate it. We're gonna have to have you on another time because it's hard to fit this all in half an hour, like you said.
I know.
I got one more quick question, because something I've been wondering about, and I'm probably gonna get the details wrong, so please correct me. But I feel like I heard that when you try to make that feature branch, you're making a whole new workspace. Is that okay? So how does that work from a data perspective? Because that confuses me a lot, right? If all right, I'm making a feature branch because I'm working in my own little space, but we're doing data intensive work, right?
Yep.
So if I have a lake house and Eugene made 1 billion rows on a VM because he's just messing around. So I've got 194 gigabytes of CSV files in bronze. I've got 60 gigabytes of Delta tables, and then I make a feature branch. Is it just making a shortcut? Is it copying all that data? What happens?
So
How does
if
that
you
work?
use the Fabric feature, you can create a branch into a new workspace. And so it automatically creates the workspace for you, and then it copies the metadata of all your Fabric items. So just the metadata.
It's a metadata only copy. That makes
Yes.
sense. Okay. And then
and that means that so there are 2 ways you can look at it. You can kind of use the mindset of every time you want to work on a new feature, you create a new branch connected to a new workspace.
Yep.
Once you're done with that, you merge it back into your main developer shared branch, and then you delete the workspace. However, if you do that every time you create a new branch in a new workspace, you would have to like get access to all of your data, rerun it, or whatever. So this is one thing that we have found works really well, is to have a workspace that is 1 per developer. Like just name it whatever dev and then your name as a suffix or whatever. So each developer has their workspace. It lives like throughout the entire development process.
okay.
And then what you'll see is that once you get data into bronze, it's fairly static, I would say, after like the initial kind of the development of that. So what you would see is the bronze layer is basically the same. I'm sorry, I just need to unplug something that will make a loud beeping noise if I don't unplug it. So in the bronze layer, you can shortcut to the main shared development data where you have everything. And that could be like also a shortcut to production data. So that means that you can have a shortcut to your production data in your own development workspace. And then you're just working on the metadata in terms of transformation into silver and gold and so on.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the approach that we see works well for us, is to have 1 workspace per developer, and then to also separate PII data into a separate workspace as well, and then separate backend and front end, just because you don't want to, you might want to have business users, super users who want to look at the semantic model. They might want to create reports. You don't really want to give them access to all of your notebooks or pipelines or data flows or whatever.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to show them how the sausage is made, right? Just give them the end product once it's been cleaned and wrapped.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And that helps answer some things because like you were talking about, oh, we do all this stuff with shortcuts and we point to bronze and all this stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, I would do that too if my alternative is copying all this stuff or reloading every single time, right?
Yeah.
So, no, this has been awesome.
And I think shortcuts is like the one feature that has not really been adopted widely yet, I would say, in Fabric. I'm sure a lot of people do, but I think a lot of people, when they think about shortcuts, it's shortcutting to source data. So it's shortcutting to Dataverse or to Amazon storage,
right? As opposed to like smart.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But you can really work smart inside of your environment as well by shortcutting to production data or shortcutting to like from your development workspace into the shared development workspace, bronze data, for example. Just make sure that you don't have to spend time creating all of these copies of all of your data. Kind of embrace that mindset coming from Microsoft of, one copy, one lake, and try to shortcut as much as possible.
You have to go with the grain of Fabric. So no, this has been awesome. I've got 2 questions for you as we wrap up. So one, what's your favorite or least favorite Fabric feature? Or both. The last guest did both.
So my least favorite warehouses. I'm sorry. I'm sure they're gonna get there eventually, but as of right now, it's completely useless. You imagine like there are certain features like varchar or like nchar not being supported. They didn't have indexes for a while. There were so many things that you would expect was there that wasn't. And then coming from a country outside of the US, collations and working with that.
Squigglies. I don't understand why.
No, but like collations, you can't change the collation, meaning that our Norwegian alphabet is being sorted the wrong way because we can't change the collation. So, I mean, just a lot of stuff. So warehouses, I don't touch it unless I really, really have to.
Speaking of collation and Norway, I've heard that when you're looking for your country, you like search for Oman and then go.
I do that. It was like you press O and then 1 up, and there's Norway. Yeah, it's what I do basically all the time. Favorite feature, I would just say notebooks in general. So I feel like notebooks, I've really learned to love them. And I feel like right now when you can have the good old PySpark notebooks, you can have pure Python notebooks, you can have T-SQL notebooks. T-SQL notebooks is something that I really love because it's an easy way to document all of your like code. If you're creating views or whatever, just selects views, whatever, just to combine that with Markdown. And now with the org apps as well, where you can actually embed the notebooks inside of an org app. So you can use that for documenting things. So you can you can run a notebook, you can get like the outputs, the built-in data visualization and things like that. You can have your documentation, examples of data, things like that in a notebook, put that in the org app, and you no longer have to create like 100 Power BI report pages to document everything. So
that's really cool.
I just need notebooks.
I have not looked at org apps yet, so I didn't realize you could put notebooks in there. So that's awesome. So then
or it's coming. I know it wasn't announced at least. So
yeah, no, I believe it. The last question is, there's way too many social media networks, but where can people find you? And is there anything you want to promote? I know you run a certain conference, so
yes, Fabric February, February 5th through 7th, 2025 in Oslo, Norway. We made sure to organize an event at the coldest, most miserable, darkest time in Norway, because that means that you're going to love sitting inside for a full day just learning and networking.
Cleveland, in Ohio, they say the same thing because their SQL Saturday used to be in February. And it's like, well, you have nowhere better to be.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're doing a 3-day event. We have our free con with Guy in a Cube. our main conference event in the largest IMAX theater in Norway. So that's going to be cool. And then we're doing 3 different role-based post-cons for data analysts, data engineers focusing on governance and platform architecture, and a third one for data analysts or real-time, real-time fabricators, I think is probably the right word for that now. Yeah. So 3-day event, fabricfebruary.com. You can find us on LinkedIn. We're on the social media platform we're not going to mention, and Blue Sky. Yeah. And sing with me. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for being on, Cathrine.
Thank you so much.